All right, great. Thanks everybody for rounding out the day. This is a good bookend as we're talking about to the earlier introduction. Ken and Paul are going to be talking about operationalizing cybersecurity. If you're not familiar with Ken, he leads our cybersecurity team as well as our privacy council. And Paul is a manager responsible for our security operations. So I really do appreciate your attention and being here on a long day. Thanks, Ken.
Thanks, Mark David. So I do think this is a good bookend to where we started with Mark David earlier today, because a lot of the stuff he talked about are things that we want to think about. How do we actually put those into a program? And this is something over the last, I would say, year I've been working on, and we brought Paul onto the team about 6 months ago. And the idea is that how do you get these things done? There's a lot to do. You've seen a lot of things today in terms of security, a lot of different parts, whether it's in the cloud, whether it's dealing with particular products, how to deal with some incident response and some other options. But how do you kind of organize this? And to be honest, this is something I had in my mind too. I've been kind of working through, how do I want to attack this? How do we look at this, and how do we approach this so that we have a comprehensive program, that we also know that this is something that we don't want to drop the ball, right? We want to make sure that we're doing the right thing. I mean, while I do work a lot with our customers across the healthcare, the financial services, but also I'm in charge of dealing with our own security, making sure our own network is addressed. Now, I'm not the operational guy, I'll be quite honest with that. That's why I have Paul here. My job is to kind of think about, from a strategic standpoint, how do we put governance in place? So what we want to do today is give you a little bit of an insight into an approach that we find useful, that you might also find useful, to take a lot of the bits and pieces, whether it's dealing with the MITRE attack and how do you want to address that, whether it's looking at how you're implementing some of the new functional features that Andreas talked about in Iris, or even trying to get your hands around the encryption part that John was talking about a little bit earlier. What are the pieces that you need to think about in terms of a programmatic approach? And one of my favorite words always has been operationalizing. How do you take something from just being on the paper to actually being something that works? So there we go. I didn't screw up the first move on the slide. That's always an important part. All right, so how do we set a foundation, right? And this to me is, by the way, full disclosure, I am a lawyer. Don't hold that against me. But as a lawyer, I always like to think about kind of what is the base document that I want to work from. I'm a big fan of, law and regulation as being a good place to start and look at things. But when you think about what you need to do in a cybersecurity program, you really have to think about what is going to be the foundation. And to me, governance is the foundation, right? Now, by the way, this is going to be a little bit upside down. I say foundation, you're going to see the governance is on the top, but just because it also works better in saying that there are supporting parts to this foundation. Just as you have to have the pillars that go down to the bedrock, that's what we're going to look to do here. Now, to me, when I talk about governance, I always talk about governance in the concept of trust, right? I have another talk that I do where I talk about building trust, and I talk about trust. The concept of trust deals with three factors. It deals with risk, it deals with reliance, and it deals with results. The way you deal with risk is through transparency. That is, the idea of risk is there's some unknown. There's something that isn't understood. A party is unclear about what could happen, right? It hasn't happened yet, but it could happen. So we have to address that. Transparency is a good way to do that in terms of spelling out what is necessary, what could happen, enumerating or quantifying what the risk is. Reliance is important too, and we deal with that through accountability, right? The idea of I will stand by what I say, and I will make sure that if it doesn't happen that way, we'll make it right. And the reliance is very important. If you think about trust, trust requires two parties. If we go to what we were talking about in John's presentation, we're just thinking about the concept of trust with a CA and some of those types of things and how we have reliance on the CA, right? It was one of those important parts that we talked about there. Reliance is a crucial part, and accountability allows us to be able to demonstrate that we can be relied upon. But the last part, and I think most important for this conversation, is dealing with the factor of results. And that is because in a trust relationship, one of the other things is that people don't know, how do we get from the as is to the to be environment? How do we go from point A to point B? What does that path look like? How are we going to navigate that? Governance, to me, always is, how do we navigate the path? To do governance in a cybersecurity environment, we're going to need three things. Now, the first thing we're going to want to have is we need to have a framework. I mentioned earlier, I like statutes, legislation, regulation. I like different types of frameworks because I'm not the brightest bulb in the bunch here, so I like to find people who are smarter than me who have come up with some really good ideas around cybersecurity, right? And we're going to talk about some of those things that are out there, but there's a lot of good frameworks that are out there that we can use to be able to drive that. And that the other thing with that is it helps make sure, gosh, do we think of everything? Right? Did we cover it all? So a framework allows us to have, if you will, that structure to be able to put onto that. The second thing is, I think this is important, and you'll see why in a little bit when we talk about the frameworks, but it relates to that, which is we need to define outcomes. Too often in the cybersecurity world, we're focused on controls. And I'll talk about this in much more detail when I get into this, but I think this is important that we have to think about how do we define the outcomes that we want, and how do we make sure that those outcomes can be then driven by the controls that we choose. And then the last part that is part of the support for that governance foundation is partnerships. In any organization, you don't have one entity, one team, one department that is managing cybersecurity, but rather it is truly a partnership effort, whether it's within the organization, but also, as Mark David was talking about when he was talking about some of the threats that are out there, bringing in the third parties that you work with, bringing in your customers. This is a whole group of people who, from a 360 viewpoint, have to be there in order to have the program. So to do governance, what we're looking at here is the frameworks, so having a structure that has been able to lay out how we would approach the cybersecurity operations. We're looking at outcomes that are allowing us to see where do we want to be. Again, this is sort of providing that pathway that we talk about with governance. And then the partnerships, making sure that we have all the right people there in order to be able to drive that forward. So when I was preparing for this, actually I was doing this on a flight to Dubai, and I was reading this book called The Cybersecurity Guide to Governance, Risk, and Compliance. GRC is a big terminology out there in the risk world, always looking at that sort of thing. This book, though, I thought was kind of interesting. Now, it's definitely a book that is heavily tailored to the financial services and U.S. financial services. It's a lot about FFIEC, for those of you who might know that particular framework. But what I did find interesting about the book was how it was thinking about these separate different parts. And really, I did like what they said about the governance. And I'll read this quote. It says, cybersecurity governance empowers us with wisdom, risk management equips us with foresight, and compliance holds us accountable to our commitment. So I liked it because it brought back a lot to my usual discussion on trust. And if you think about the whole reason why you have cybersecurity is so you can build trust, both with the teams that you work with as well as with your customers in that sense. And I thought this was a really kind of an interesting way to kind of view it. But really that first sentence of the governance empowering the organization. Without governance, none of this is going to really be possible. All right. So what are some of the key aspects that we have for cybersecurity governance? Well, we talk about accountability frameworks, and I mentioned the whole idea of accountability is to say, basically, I will make sure that what I say is going to happen does happen. This is crucial, right? Being very clear, we'll talk about this in a little bit too, which is, I'm not going to stop, Paul's not going to stop the attacks from happening, right? You're not going to prevent the bad. But what you have to be there is to say, if we've stated a particular outcome, if we've stated that we're going to have a particular goal, that will be addressed. We will make sure that it is there, and it will hold us, have the ability to have the roles and the responsibilities to make sure that that occurs. The next part is really security decision making. How do I choose from A, B, and C? How do I make sure that am I making the right choice? Why would I choose A when I could choose B? I was just out in the hallway talking with a colleague of mine, and we were just talking about that stress of you have something presented in front of you and you got to make that decision of, gosh, if I do this, what if I make the wrong decision, right? Well, governance helps you make that decision. It helps guide you, and it doesn't mean you're always going to make the right decision, but you can have confidence that you're approaching that in a way that allows you to be able to make those decisions in a knowledgeable and thoughtful way. Risk management. I'm a risk management professional, been that for too many years, too many decades to say that. But the reality is risk management still is what we're all in the business about, right? When we talk about cybersecurity, yes, there's a lot of operational things that we're going to do. There's a lot of different things we're going to do with technology. But really, in the end, we're managing risk. The world out there is a very different space than it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago. Policies and procedures. This is the boring part of governance, right? But it's actually probably the most important part. I mean, if you walked into an organization and you said, show me your policy on encryption, show me your policy on acceptable use, show me your policy on access controls. If that's not defined, if that's not written down, how can you expect the organization to get that right? Again, this idea of governance being, what's the path, right? How do you know that people will be able to read the map if they aren't given the legend to be able to understand what road that they're supposed to be on? And then the last part is incident response. And we'll talk a little bit more about this, especially, and Paul will talk a little bit about some of the partnerships that are there. But really, unfortunately, cybersecurity, the whole reason why it exists is to deal with incidents. Like if we didn't have hackers, if we didn't have people trying to do things, well, security would be like when I was back in 1985 working on mainframes for Burroughs Corporation. And security still existed then, right? But we were much more focused on availability and integrity. Confidentiality wasn't the big deal. People were not hacking into those types of mainframes in the same way, and not to say that they weren't at all, but they weren't doing it the same way that things are happening today. Reality is cybersecurity programs exist for the sole purpose of dealing with incident response. All right, so what do we need to do? What do we need to think about in terms of how do we put this together and how do we think of it? And I mentioned I really like frameworks. Well, I really like the new NIST Cybersecurity Framework version 2. I really think that NIST has upped the game. The previous frameworks were good. They were very good. There was a really good thoughts. But I think they've really begun to solidify. In fact, the approach they've taken in allowing for the application of the framework. It's not just, they didn't just come up with a framework that said, here are the elements that you need to make sure it's in a program, here's how you need to deal with governance, but rather what they pushed here was how do we begin to look at those different pieces that are there. And they've broken it into 6 different domains. Of course, the first one is govern, right? How do we make sure that we have those parts and pieces that go together to make sure that we have that program there? Again, policies and procedures being a big, big part of what we talk about this. The next one is identify. You probably have been through other cybersecurity presentations where people said you have to identify your assets, right? We talked about that a little bit earlier. Mark David mentioned that during his presentation. It's crucial that you understand what is it that you have to protect. What is the network? What is the environment? What are the servers? Without knowing any of that, you really can't do anything to protect those things. Well, that gets us to the next part, which is protect. Now we're going to think about what are the people, the processes, the technology that we need to put in place to be able to drive the protections to prevent or at least mitigate the risks that are going to come from the cyber threats that are out there. Detect, well, this is an obvious one to me, just like identify, knowing what it is that you have to protect. Detect is, I need to be able to know when something has happened, right? And know about it, hopefully in a way, in a form that allows me to take action appropriately in a timely manner. Then, if there is an incident, we need to be able to respond. And here, we need to do the eradication of the threat. We need to do the containment of the threat. We need to make sure that we're putting ourselves in a place that, okay, the bad thing has happened. The threat actor has gotten in the door. The threat actor has taken action. Whatever that is, however far they've gotten, we've now been able to take some sort of response to be able to get that dealt with. And that's becomes a very important part. This is where actually making sure that you actually go beyond just the policies and procedures, and now you have training, right? Now you have tabletops, right? One of the things that I'm pushing very hard with having Paul on board is we're working really hard on our incident response playbooks. Because we had incident response, we had a process that we would follow, but it wasn't as coordinated, going back to kind of the whole concept of partnership in a little bit, right? But we needed to make sure that we had everyone being able to, if you will, sing from the same songbook. And that's a crucial part of this. So being able to make sure that you can respond and respond in a coordinated fashion is going to be crucial. And then the last part is really recover. How do you get back? Because as a former boss once told me when we were in the midst of an incident, that it's not if we recover, it's when we recover, right? These things are all recoverable. The damage may be very great, damage may be very little, but the reality is you need to make sure as part of that, the recovery is how do you get yourself back to normal, right? How do you close that delta between what has happened in the incident to what is now your operations? And also, by the way, part of recover is what are the lessons learned? What did we not deal with? What outcomes have we not addressed? So what's really interesting in the framework itself is these 6 areas are defined not by controls. You know, for those of you who are familiar with NIST or familiar with, say, ISO, you might know for NIST there's special publication 800-53. I think they're on revision 6 these days. ISO 27001, the 2022 version, right? Those have controls in them. They specifically say, you should do this for access control. You should do this for encryption. You should do this for acceptable use. You should do this. It's very control-based. Here, we're very focused on how do we address the outcomes for each of these different areas. And like I said, I want to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Now, like I said, I really thought that NIST has done a really good job of thinking about the framework as a foundation for a lot of the other things. So this quote comes from the document you can see here on the side. This is not the Cybersecurity Framework, but rather Special Publication 800-61 Revision 3. Just came out in April. And what's really interesting, this was, for those of you who might remember, the original 61 that had in it was basically computer emergency response team actions. Really old-fashioned, right? We don't even call it computer emergency response anymore, right? But back then, it had all the various different steps you might think of that you might want to do. Now, what they've done is they've said, listen, if you look at the cybersecurity framework, this concept of detect, respond, recover, that now is your incident response framework. And it integrates in with the preparedness that they talked about in the old version of 61. That goes to the govern and to the identify and the protect. All those pieces now all work together. Now, I really liked this whole paragraph. I won't read the whole thing to you, but basically, incident response now is, as I mentioned before, this is what we're working to. This isn't, again, the whole idea is it's not if, it's when. So the whole purpose for a cybersecurity program is incident response. Everything you do is to be ready for that incident, because it's not that you're going to stop everything. Not everything in this world can be prevented. Not everything in this world can be avoided. But rather, we now have to have a way to be able to go and address that in a comprehensive way. And this document, I think, is the proof, because what we've seen now is, rather than it being a standalone document, it becomes what we call, under the NIST Cybersecurity Framework parlance, it is now a community profile. It is using the structure of the framework, a way to approach those outcomes that are there. All right, I've been making this point about outcomes versus controls. What's the big deal? Well, I think if you think about outcomes and then you think about controls, the issue here is what is good and bad about each of them. By the way, I'll be very clear, even though I'm a big fan of outcomes, it's not that outcomes are the only way to do it and controls are bad, but rather we have to recognize controls might only get us so far. And I think that the key points in this slide that I want to kind of bring forward to you is that the nice thing about outcomes is it allows you to design your cybersecurity program to be robust to the business. If you think about a controls-based, one of the challenges that you have with a controls-based environment is that a lot of times those controls are defined and it just might not work. How do you address when you need to have a certain amount of openness, a certain amount of disclosure, right? Where your outcome might be that I want to make sure that that disclosure is done properly, that it has integrity in the data, that it is addressed in a way that keeps that information protected, right? Which might not be as possible in a controls type of approach where it says, nope, this is the control, right? Us being in the healthcare space and we do hosting in our managed services, we apply HITRUST to our US hosted managed services. HITRUST, which I like a lot, is a very defined control program. If any of you who have ever worked with HITRUST will know that it's very specific. You know, you will have this type of access control. You will have this type of measure, right? You will have this type of acceptable use control, set of controls. You may not do less. You might not even be able to do more, right? It's very prescriptive in that sense. Controls, though, do give us the ability to know specific actions to take. But outcomes allow us to be able to think about how do we want to get to that end result. Remember, governance that we're talking about here, this is one of the supporting pillars for that, is to allow us to be able to better define the path between the as is to the to be. So I think that that's kind of a general way to look at that. The next step, I think, and turn it over to Paul about this is, and the reason why we kind of broke it up 2/3 for me and 1/3 for Paul is that I actually think that what I talked about is only half the story. The other half is the partnership. So let me turn it over to you, sir.
Thanks, Ken. So actually going to go back real quick to, in the spirit of keeping things real and relevant, like the title of this slide, provide a brief story that hopefully highlights these two areas here. So in a previous life, I spent a lot of time in a SCIF where, with the military, which is where classified information is stored and you handle classified information. And so one of the, there are audits that occur there, and one of the audits is effectively, I'll simplify it, but it's checking the stickers on the computers or on the different machines to make sure that they're labeled and also they're labeled in a particular manner. But that was the requirement, making sure that the stickers are on the machine and on the right stickers on the right machine. However, when the security office would come by to do either the pre-audit to the big audit or the big audit would come by, we would get flagged often because the stickers weren't in a particular order. Now the order of the stickers was not a requirement. However, that was a way that the security office wanted to see that implemented. And that interrupts the workflow of your kind of everyday use, right? And so that's a kind of a small and silly example, but the point being is that the outcome is the important piece. Hey, is the appropriate information labeled in the appropriate manner? Not is it labeled in the right order in the appropriate manner. And so the outcome of that is we lose trust in the security office, because rather than using them as a partner, they're now someone who every time that they come by, we're concerned, we're going to get flagged with something, more work's going to be the outcome, or you're going to hear about it one way or the other. So moving on to partnerships here, and this is how we have decided to approach the security operations organization within InterSystems, and it's primarily partnerships internally. And so the common model is can be seen in a lot of frustrations that security organizations will face, which is there's a security issue, we'll call it the technical side doesn't really agree with that issue. It might get elevated, it might not, but there's a lot of friction between what gets implemented and what doesn't. And the outcome of that is either that friction and or the security team says, okay, I'm still responsible for that risk, but if I'm unable to get the controls that I care about implemented or the requirements met, I'm going to build a moat around whatever the thing is. So you're just kind of adding bloat to it, bloat to whatever your infrastructure application is. And so that kind of becomes the shift left model that has been popularized recently. But I think it's a bit more than that, where you want to, the security team, you don't want to just incorporate security early in the process, which you do, because you then don't have to add that bloat that I mentioned. But the security team is able to provide more value to the actual operations side of the house when they're involved earlier, when they understand the, we'll call it the business unit side of the house a bit more. What are their concerns, their SLA concerns, their uptime concerns, their cost concerns? So by the security team kind of integrating themselves a bit earlier in trying to work to be a partner with the operations team or whatever is on the customer facing side, it provides a way for both sides to understand each other a bit more and in a manner where you can rely on each other as a partnership rather than the probably the stereotypical auditing perspective of, hey, every time audit's going to come by, we're going to get work to do, we're going to be told that things are wrong because they want to implement things in a particular manner. And so, in addition to this partnership approach, what I was hinting to just before is we have attempted to make ourselves or position ourselves in more of a consultative manner rather than a directive manner. And that's actually one of the reasons that that the NIST CSF framework works for us, because it helps rather than having to tell people, hey, you need to do this. You can mold the framework to your organization, and we can approach security in a manner that molds the different business units that we support. And so this is how, rather simple model, but how we've tried to align ourselves within the organization. And that is through the supported or supporting concept, which is, hey, if you're going to have, let's say, two parties, one of them is probably the one that needs to be supported in whatever the endeavor is. The other one is going to be supporting the other unit there. And so what this does is this makes the lines between the two organizations, sub-organizations, a lot cleaner. Because you're no longer in a situation where both sides, both parties think that their desired outcomes are the primary objective. And if there is a conflict, or if there's a disagreement, I'll say, you can rather simply elevate that up to whatever the next level is. So if it's called a minor issue that in this case security wants to see implemented, and the ops side of the house doesn't think it's worth it, or the risk is mitigated in another manner, or whatever the case may be, you can kind of let the issue go there. But if it's a bigger issue, you can elevate that to the next level. And in a very simple organization structure, you can see this in the CEO, CTO, and CISO role, where there's the reason why the CISO doesn't report to the CTO is if these conflicts arise, you have a decision maker in the CEO who then owns that risk. They are the final, they can be the final decision maker who says, hey, this is on me, we're going to go forward and do this. And that concept applies throughout the organization, doesn't just have to happen in the C-suite.
Real quick on that one too, one thing to add is this isn't a new concept that we're talking about here. This is something where, you know, we're actually taking something, and I took something from my time working in the government. I worked on the National Security Council. It's a very similar concept of this idea of supporting and supported, right? The idea was that in order to deal with issues at a policy level, you would have a policy coordinating committee. That committee would work through things. If there was a disagreement, it would then get elevated up to the next level where we'd have what we call the deputies committee. This is typically the deputies of all the agencies that are part of the National Security Council, right? And there you would have the idea of being able to have decisions being made that couldn't be made at the lower level. If there's a conflict there, then that would get prioritized or deconflicted out up at the next level, which we call the primary committee. Now, these would be what we call the PCs. So this would be the Attorney General, this would be the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Homeland Security. The idea is the same of what we're talking about here, right? Is to make sure that you have the ability to drive the outcomes. I mean, if you think about the way the National Security Council is supposed to work, it's not driven on controls, right? We're not looking to see, you know, what are the different controls that we put in place to protect the nation, but rather we're looking at the outcomes. And those outcomes have to be balanced between what does State Department want to do for diplomacy? What does Homeland Security want to do for customs? What does the FBI need to deal with in terms of domestic policing? These are all the different things that would be happening there, so you have to balance those things out. And therefore you have kind of both ways. Sometimes the organization is the supporting organization, sometimes it's the supported. But the idea is to have that ability to run those things up. And on this slide, I think the most important thing is what that gets you to is to provide value and drive that value forward in that sense. So.
Yep, and so to kind of zoom in on InterSystems here, so often cybersecurity, we see ourselves as a supporting organization to usually the managed services side of the house, who the customers interact with, at least technically speaking, and we can help them and ideally, like Ken said, provide value. And so a big push that we have had is trying to shore up the incident response aspect of the company and cybersecurity in particular. So within incident response, you obviously have the incident response itself, and the technical problem there is rather obvious, right? You know, if you have some sort of breach or incident like that, that problem kind of speaks for itself. It might be a complicated one, but it's one that usually has a defined solution one way or the other. In addition to the technical problem, you have a people problem. Unless you're in an organization where, you know, you're alone and unafraid and you're the only person, then you don't have anyone to talk to. But as soon as communication comes in the loop, particularly with other people, other departments, maybe different time zones, different methods of communication, things can start getting lost in the ether rather quickly. And what could be a pretty simple, straightforward approach can get complicated rather quickly. And so identifying who those people are, what those lines of communication are, is probably more important than the technical problem, because the technical problem, there are too many solutions there, or too many potential issues there to really play out, at least at a practical level. And so the next piece in supporting incident response is preparation. So like Ken mentioned earlier, we're doing that through the creation of playbooks. And those are being supported by tabletops, which, again, not a new concept. However, the way that we approached them was having a tabletop that was probably unrealistic in some sense. And if you create an unrealistic tabletop for a technical crowd, they'll let you know that it's unrealistic. But the point of the tabletop isn't so much the technical issue, it's the people and it's the process piece of it. And so as we are trying to shore up these processes, we're able to sit around with everyone in the room and identify what the lines of communication are, what are the processes, how things are going to be pushed out, and the biggest one, who owns the risk? Because you want to know who owns the risk prior to there being an actual incident, because if there's an incident, nobody's then going to want to raise their hand and say, hey, this is my problem, right? Because there's no incentive model there. So you want to know who owns the risk prior to that, however you want to divvy that up, whether it's resource, whether it's business unit, whatever the case may be, but identifying those lines and what the escalation step is, because inevitably there is someone who owns the risk, and at the top level it's a CEO owner, but ideally things don't get to that.
Well, and to add to that, one of the approaches that we took with the playbooks is we actually let each separate team build their own playbook. Now we gave them some basic frameworks and some other stuff to kind of think about so they could guide their own way through. But I would say, each of those playbooks are very different, continue to be very different. And the whole idea is that we weren't driving. I didn't want a form, right? I didn't want everyone to have 10 steps in it, right? What I wanted them to do is solve that problem, right? And the problem being the technical problem as well as the people problem. And what was interesting was we did initially some what I'll call walkthroughs, basically, or dry runs, probably the first one we did, where literally we just kind of went through the steps and said, does this make sense? And also everybody was in the room. So some people are going, why am I sitting here? We're talking about that team. Yeah, but is there anything there you're hearing that seems odd, strange, doesn't make sense to you, right? And so we had some of those conversations. The second time we got together, we got everybody together in the same room. We said, okay, this is the unrealistic scenario we created to make sure that we could actually have an incident that would flow through each of the teams, right? And it was great because you got to the point, well, first off, they said, well, that would never happen, right? It was like, okay, suspend disbelief was my saying throughout the entire tabletop. But what was really interesting is actually the key point that we got to that was communications, right? The big thing that we came out of, everyone was like, oh, wow, yeah. You know what, I know that doesn't mean me, but because it could mean me, I need to know at what point, and we were having those discussions about, okay, what does that mean? How do we get to that point? How do we understand when it is that we need to engage with more people? How do we engage? How do we want to engage? We started getting into the weeds a little bit in terms of the actual technology that we were going to use, but I think it was really good in the sense of everyone kind of going, yeah, that's, when something happens, whether it starts here, 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 or here, this is the point at which we want to say, we all need to know about it, even if it doesn't mean anything for us. And I think that was kind of, to me, I felt like we had success. Are we fully trained up on our incident response? Hell no. But we do now have everybody recognizing that there is the commonality. To kind of go back and think about this in terms of the preparation, the playbooks now are common, even if they're different, if that makes sense to everybody, right? The approach is that we know that everyone will address things in the way that they need to address it to build that value, to be able to get to that, going back to the supporting and supported organization.
And so next with the preparation piece, InterSystems is making a push to cloud services. And so part of the preparation we'll call it a self-hosted model, is you had to be able to find and eradicate any potential issues that might occur in your environment. If you're in a cloud native model, or if you're deployed in a cloud native model, you can utilize that model to your advantage. And what that means is just, hey, if you can blow things away and redeploy them in a manner that's quicker than finding and eradicating an issue, just do that, right? But you need to make sure you have a couple things in place, namely your, customer communication. Are they aware that this could happen, and what are your agreements with your customer? Is your database backed up at a frequency that makes this tenable? And are you able to deploy in a manner that can reduce this downtime to a sufficient level? And so lastly, going back to the business value piece that I mentioned, I think, in the last slide. So how can cybersecurity provide value to the business? Because typically security is there to reduce risk, right? But how can you also provide value to the organization? So that can be done in the form of helping with certifications. So if you are if you're able to be the liaison of some sort between the certifying body and whatever business unit is getting certified, you can help there. You can provide confidence both internally and externally. So executives in your organization are likely concerned to some degree with a cyber incident, right? They make the news often. And if they see that you are well prepared and well thought out, that concern of theirs can greatly be mitigated. And also on the customer side, right? We have seen an increase in customers reaching out saying, hey, what does your incident response look like? And if we can come back and say, hey, we have a well-defined methodology of doing things, that provides a lot of comfort for people that are in a rather critical field, being healthcare, financial services, or logistics. And the last piece of business value is that if you are able to present yourself as a partner, going back to that sticker story I mentioned earlier, you open up an avenue for the additional business unit that you're supporting to see you as a partner, and most importantly as a third-party consultant that they can then bounce ideas off of, rather than saying, hey, I have this hard technical problem, I can go left, I can go right. If security comes back with, well, you can't do either of those, and now I know a little bit more about what you're doing, and actually all that has to change, that's just going to cause a headache, and you're not going to get you're not going to be brought in on any future conversations because you're no longer beneficial, or you just add work to that organization. So you're able to act as that consultant in that consultative role or third-party support role, outside advisor, to just improve the organization and just hopefully prove yourself of value on multiple levels.
So I want to thank everybody for spending the day with us. Really appreciate coming to the late session, the last session here. If you guys have any questions, we're happy to take them now, or feel free to step up afterwards. And we obviously have our EAP program up there. I made a very big QR just because I wanted to impress Mark David.
Well, with that, Ken, what does the FBI say about QR codes?
Anything that is uncontrolled, FBI isn't too happy with, I would say be very careful. I mean, two things I always tell people, well, three things actually. Do not pick up stray USB drives, please, okay? Do not use stray USB cables or plug into stray USB ports. I always, carried in my pocket right now, you'll note that it's cheap, stupid little thing, but I'm gonna plug my own brick in because you don't know what's on the other side of that port, right? And QR codes, don't click on any QR code that you don't know where that's going. This one, it's safe. I vouch for it.
Trust me.
Trust me.
I'm a lawyer.
All right, thank you everybody, appreciate it.